This story begins in the year 1972 in Statesville Maximum Security Prison in Crest Hill, Illinois. An inmate by the name of Julius Davis joined in with a semi-religious group called the Cosmos, which happened to be a group of Chicago gang members from the west side of Chicago. I do not know what gang Julius Davis was a member of, but he organized the men to create their own crime syndicate that would become the Royal Family. Members of this group were in street gangs like Black Gangster Disciples and Vice Lords, and they were some of the most hardcore gang members of these gangs. They set aside their rivalry to be a part of the Royal Family. One of the prominent members was Maurice King Baldy Jackson. The men that joined the Royal Family were scheduled to be released from prison in 1972, and they planned a coming together once released and going on a crime spree. It is interesting to me how all these men just so happened to be released at the same time. This leads me to believe the Royal Family consulted with Jeepers for their legal advice, and perhaps Jeepers helped them to fight their legal battles and get released. Thomas Jeepers Jefferson, who was born in 1922 in Mississippi. Jefferson and his family moved to the west side of Chicago when Jeepers was just a boy back in the 1920s. By the time the Great Depression began, Jeepers' family was impoverished and could not afford much. According to the September 15, 2014, Chicago Sun-Times article about him, he stole a pair of pants from an open-air market as a boy because his parents could not afford clothes for him. A few years later, he stole another pair of pants and soon became hooked on stealing fancy clothes. He was caught on his second theft and was defended by the infamous lawyer Clarence Darrow, and Jefferson was impressed by the lawyer's way of using the legal system to get a desired outcome. Jefferson graduated to armed robbery and ended up in prison in 1941, according to a September 16, 1976, Jet magazine article. After this, he went on many robbery capers and stole lots of money, doing 5 prison terms in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Jefferson boasted he never hurt anyone during his capers. Jeepers became a genius when it came to studying the law and became more knowledgeable than many high-priced, trained lawyers. During his many stints in prison, he helped several inmates get released, get fair trials, and be treated correctly when facing the judicial system. In exchange, inmates would help him out in different ways. Jeepers worked with members of just about every major gang in Chicago, as Jeepers was not a gangbanger. However, he was especially embraced by Booney Black as a close friend and was a member of the Black Gangsters' New Breeds. Additionally, Jeepers was well known to be a colorful storyteller who loved to share his criminal exploits of being the stick-up man. I theorize it is very possible he told these stick-up stories to the Royal Family and inspired them to begin this armed robbery spree they were about to embark upon when released. Doing stick-ups became the early pastime of the Royal Family, and they may have been helped along with advice from Jeepers himself while they were all locked up together. Jeepers was in prison in the early 70s, so it is very possible. One thing to clarify though, the violence that was committed along the way of the Royal Family's robberies would have not been part of Jeepers' advice. Jeepers was never a violent man in any way, shape, or form. Jeepers was said to be a good man and kind-hearted. In April of 1972, the Royal Family members were released from prison, including the 24-year-old leader Julius Davis. Davis made the first move for the Royal Family as he targeted the Talho restaurant at 1513 Chicago Avenue in the suburb of Evanston. Davis had worked there for only 1 week in June of 1972 until he was fired. Now, the following week on June 16, 1972, Davis, Teddy Candler, and one other burst into the restaurant as it closed, wildly wielding kitchen knives, demanding money from patrons and the restaurant owner. The 3 men tied up 2 patrons while they escorted the owner, assistant manager, and the assistant manager's relative into the office to open the safe. When there was some refusal to open the safe, the men reacted violently and stabbed the owner in the chest and 3 times in the back. Then they stabbed the assistant manager twice in the back, killing them both. Candler and Davis did not wear masks or gloves and made off with $300. Police very easily tracked down Candler and arrested him. Police went searching for Julius Davis because they had a positive identification from witnesses. This angered the rest of the Royal Family because Davis was reckless and did not use a mask or gloves, and the robbery was very sloppy. The royal family then made the decision to eliminate their leader and managed to hunt him down before police could find him. On June 18, 1972, police found the burned body of Julius Davis, as he had also been shot 7 times and left at 3748 South Wabash in the Grand Boulevard neighborhood of Chicago. Davis also suffered burns indicating he was tortured. The investigating officer was the notorious John Burge, who was later indicted on charges in 1993 of torturing and murdering suspects while forcing confessions. Given that it was Burge at the scene, who knows what all could have transpired with this murder. Allegedly, at the time, police did not know that Davis was killed by his own gang, but later they would find out all about the royal family and the motive for the murder. The rampage of the royal family had just begun. As I stated earlier, Jeepers committed so many armed robberies without hurting anyone, and I would not be surprised if his beliefs in nonviolent robbery were adopted by the royal family, perhaps at Jeepers' wishes, but Julius Davis and Teddy Candler did not follow those beliefs, and that very likely was one of the reasons the men were removed. The biggest reason would have been no mask or gloves and being sloppy. Now that Davis was eliminated, Roger Cochise Collins took over as the new leader of the royal family. Cochise would gain much more respect and was considered the godfather of the organization and presided over the Council of War. Collins wanted his organization to function more like a syndicate with the distribution of drugs, murder for hire, robbery, and intimidation and elimination of witnesses. Collins connected with the Chicago outfit back in 1971 when he was in prison with Robert "Fat Man" Cruz and royal family member Murray Hooper. Cruz was an excellent connection because he was the cousin of Harry Aleman, who was the Chicago outfit's chief hitman. And Cruz was also the nephew of Joseph Joe Nagal Ferriola, the chief enforcer of the Chicago outfit. This connection would bring the royal family murder for hire contracts to kill for the Chicago outfit, and later would connect the royal family to the outfit for narcotics trafficking. Jeepers also claimed that while he was in prison in the 1930s, Al Capone himself nicknamed him Jeepers because of how Jeepers looked. However, it was said another wise guy was the actual one to give him that nickname, and Jeepers perhaps did not want to reveal the real name or just wanted to add color to his story. The royal family had no tolerance for witnesses and dealt with them in a brutal way. The first example of this was in May of 1972, right before the Talho heist. On May 17, 1972, 3 royal family members held up a tavern in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood at 505 West 79th Street. The next day, the royal family felt that the bartender Joseph Murphy might be able to identify them, so 5 members of the gang went into the tavern on May 19th and lit up Murphy in a hail of gunfire as the bartender was brutally shot 10 times. Anthony Holmes, one of the members, was charged with the murder. On June 14, 1972, right before the Talho hold-up, Roger Collins and Richard Black robbed 2 customers and 3 employees at the Morseview drugstore at 1448 West Morse Avenue in the Rogers Park neighborhood. The men made off with $939, but police soon chased them down to Lake Shore Drive, where they crashed their car during a high-speed chase. Black and Collins were now in court for this case for months. Then on September 13, 1972, a man visited witness Sidney Frankfurt and said he was Collins and Black's lawyer and tried to convince Frankfurt not to testify and showed pictures of Frankfurt and other employees. The incident was chilling, but Frankfurt still wanted to testify. On October 29, 1972, men burst into the drugstore and kidnapped Frankfurt and his cashier Mrs. N. Barton. The 2 were stuffed into a truck and driven to 57th and LaSalle in the Washington Park neighborhood. Then the 2 were shot and killed. Then the car was set on fire. The royal family did not appreciate witnesses to their drug trafficking activities either. The royal family had even established connections within the Chicago Police Department by 1972. Maurice King Baldy Jackson had come across information that Harold Bush was informing police of the royal family's drug trafficking operations. Jackson and police officer Chester Thomas kidnapped Harold Bush from the intersection of 14th and Western Avenue. Then they drove him to 130th and Indiana onto a secluded dirt road in the Riverdale neighborhood. The men shot Bush in the neck and left him, but Bush survived and implicated the 2. Both Jackson and Thomas were arrested for attempted murder. Officer Thomas was also being implicated in an August 19, 1972 triple murder, where a witness saw Thomas's license plates pull away from the scene of the crime at 1646 South Pulaski in the North Lawndale neighborhood. Maurice Jackson was implicated in another royal family murder in October of 1973 after police arrested royal family members Marvin Duncan and Fred Weaver. They found the wallet and identification of Darnell Carr, who had just been bound, gagged, and brutally beaten to death at 9147 South Ashland Avenue in the Burnside neighborhood. Weaver told police Maurice Jackson ordered this murder. The gang would continue their rampage. On July 5, 1973, Walter Wilburn, Leroy Williams, and Jeffrey Bowen robbed Judy's Lounge at 2852 East 87th Street in the South Chicago neighborhood. When Officer Randall came to the scene, the men shot him and they fled. The officers survived, and all three royal family members were convicted. In 1974, royal family gang member John Miles went on a major armed robbery spree as he was arrested for 10 or more armed robberies, one that resulted in him shooting a store clerk in the back. The royal family was robbing and killing across the country and had major drug operations on the South Side, as they were implicated in as many as 30 murders across the country between 1972 and 1974. Anyone that was a state's witness would either be intimidated or killed. One such incident was an undertaker that was present during one of the royal family's armed robberies and wanted to cooperate as a witness. The witness was in fear for his life, and police offered protection by having police guards present at his funeral home. One night, the royal family dug up one of the bodies from the nearby grave and threw it through the window of the funeral parlor office to intimidate the witness after midnight that night. This was a show of power and intimidation. By the summer of 1974, police cracked down hard on the royal family and made 13 arrests of members of the gang. The police had implicated that Roger Cochise Collins was the leader of the gang, and the gang had drug operations in Chicago and Gary, Indiana. Members of the gang were brought up on trial for various crimes, but sentences that were handed down were extremely light, as members only got a few years apiece. However, police were able to boast that they dissolved the gang's operations, as they stated in the August 24, 1974, Tribune article. It could be possible that their connection with Jeepers may have helped them get the legal counsel they needed, thus leading to light sentences. In 1977 through 1979, many royal family members were being released from prison for their part in the 1972 to 1974 crime spree. Members of the gang went back to work by March of 1979. That started with the murder of Donald Curtis, the owner of the Blinking Cat Lounge, located at 87th and Peoria in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood. They robbed the bar and gunned down the owner with semi-automatic weapons on March 31, 1979. On May 7, 1979, the gang stormed Metropolitan Insurance Company in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood located at 9046 South Ashland Avenue, where they robbed the place at gunpoint. As they fired several bullets near witnesses to scare them, they made off with $19,000. On August 7, 1979, also in the Auburn Gresham neighborhood, the gang hit Concord gas station located at 440 West 87th Street. Police arrested the men and found a stash of weapons that included a shotgun and a semi-automatic carbine. On August 27, 1979, Roger Cochise Collins was released from prison and immediately went to work putting the royal family back together as he reunited with paroled gang members. Once Cochise was out of prison, he was immediately given a murder-for-hire contract. The ex-husband of Catherine Tynes hired Collins, Maurice Powell, and the nephew of Collins to kill Catherine Tynes because they were having a property dispute. Maurice Powell was the ringleader of the robberies early in the year while Collins was still in prison. Now Collins was back in charge, and him and Powell now carried out this contract. Police were frustrated that the royal family was back at it again and were even more furious all these men received parole. By December of 1979, Roger Collins had set up a drug ring at 2240 South State Street, which is within the Harold Ikes projects located in the near South Side neighborhood. This brought about gang wars with the Black Gangster disciples that were trying to control the drug trade in these projects that became bloody by 1980. On the night of November 12, 1980, the drug disputes with rival dealers in the Ike's projects escalated when Murray Hooper, Maurice Pimp Powell, and Roger Cochise Collins kidnapped Frederick Lacy, R.C. Pettigrew, and Roger Holliman as they rounded the men up at an apartment at 2240 State Street. The three men were tied up and led to a vehicle, then driven to the intersection of Roosevelt and Clark in the South Loop area and brought under the viaduct. Frederick Lacy was shot execution style in the back of the head. R.C. Pettigrew was shot in the face, in the chest, and in the leg, and was also shot 4 times in the back. Roger Holliman had been shot 3 times in the back and shot once in the back of the neck. Police found the dead bodies the next day, and the men were convicted of these murders. Even though these royal family members were being sought for the November 12th triple murder, they still managed to kill Cloretta Ladd on December 2, 1980, in a South Side shootout with a gang only said to be the Disciples in the 1981 Chicago Tribune article. The shootout was with the Black Gangster Disciples because only them and the L. Rookins ran those buildings at the time. The rampage of the royal family continued in 1980, and the leadership was being sought as authorities were, especially after Roger Collins, Maurice Powell, and Murray Hooper, but the 3 men had fled to Phoenix, Arizona after they committed these drug-related murders. The trio had flown to Arizona because they were handed down a contract from the Chicago outfit to kill a print shop business owner named William Redmond. The contract was passed down by Robert "Fat Man" Cruz that had connected with the royal family when he was in jail with Roger Collins and Murray Hooper back in 1971. Now, almost a decade later, Cruz needed the royal family's assistance in removing Redmond, who was in the way of Cruz's real estate interest. Cruz had moved to Arizona to get involved in the real estate business, which is why he had interest in this property that Redmond refused to give up. Cruz now offered $10,000 to the royal family to kill Redmond. On December 31, 1980, Murray Hooper, Roger Collins, and a former Chicago policeman, Edward McCall, burst into the home of Redmond. The men then tied up Redmond, his wife, and his 70-year-old mother-in-law. They were laid on the bed and shot in the back of the head execution style. After they were killed, Murray Hooper slit Redmond's throat to show the outfit that they were brutal killers and should be hired again. The 3 men were arrested for these murders. Edward McCall was the first one to be taken down. McCall then hired his lawyer Michael Pritzker to get him out of the charges. When Pritzker failed to get McCall out of the charges completely, an unknown gunman attempted to kill Pritzker right outside his home in Chicago. Pritzker knew the gunman but refused to divulge who shot him and dropped McCall as his client. Murray Hooper ended up admitting to the killing and named his boss Roger Collins as involved in the murder. This led to the conviction of Roger Cochise Collins, and now he was headed back to prison in 1981. George Booney Black Davis was also headed to prison in 1981. On May 6, 1981, at the apartment of Linda Dates, located at 1440 South Kedzie in the North Lawndale neighborhood, 3 men came to her door that she recognized. She recognized the men as members of the Black Gangster Disciples, according to court documents, or at least that is the rumor she heard. The men were George Booney Black Davis, Moto, also referred to as Johnny Gat, and Smokey, also known as Curtis Taylor or Lee. The men came to the apartment to allegedly buy $100 worth of cocaine from Lex Leaks, who was known in the neighborhood to be a cocaine dealer. Apparently, an argument broke out between Johnny Gat and Leaks about the weight of the cocaine that resulted in a shootout that left Leaks dead and his roommate wounded. Shortly after the murder, police attempted to apprehend the men, but all of them tried to flee and destroy evidence, including George Davis, after the police came to his apartment at 3317 West Madison. When police came to arrest Davis, he ran into an abandoned apartment and locked himself and then fled down the stairwell with a shotgun in his hand after he dropped evidence, which was another firearm. According to court documents, Davis surrendered eventually. According to court documents, George Davis had been released from prison within 5 years and had violated his parole. While incarcerated in 1981 in the Illinois Department of Corrections, the royal family gang leader Cochise had met with Booney Black's Black Gangsters and the leadership of the Goon Squad Gangsters, and agreed to combine and form the Black Gangster Nation, which later merged with the newly developed New Breeds, becoming what we know now as New Breed Black Gangsters. As you can tell from the history of this organization, the new breed black gangsters are far more different than any Chicago street gang and is looked at as more of a mob or organized syndicate than a street gang in the sense of common gang bangers.